Ragu, not this bottled atrocity, mind you, is really any meat-based sauce that's usually served with pasta. While Italy is normally associated with ragu, there are versions in many other nations because the basic idea of simmering meat and tomatoes and then pouring it over noodles is pretty obvious. If you're an Italian and offended by the use of the word ragu here, I want to inform you that the original first Italian ragu prepared for the cardinal who would later become pope in the 18th century contained cinnamon, flour, and no tomatoes at all. That's the real original ragu. There are countless versions today, but this is undoubtedly one of the most unusual and one of the most flavorful.
Begin with a really fat, thick beef shank, and I've tied up the shank with a few strands of string here to make sure that it stays together. And some coarse black pepper. Make sure that it's coarse grind, because if it's not, it'll burn. Just a little bit. Then a little bit of oil. You oil the meat. Brown it well. I have the heat set on about 8 out of 1 to 10, quite high. And during this time, we get the other ingredients together. I've got about 100 grams of red bell pepper, about 100 grams of shallots, a good bunch of thyme, 1 good solid sprig of rosemary, about 1.5 tablespoons of paprika. It's a lot of paprika, and about 60 grams of passata. And the wine that I'm using for this is a Hungarian medium, semi-sweet red wine. I rarely use semi-sweet wines in cooking, but this is an exception. So, let's go get that meat out of the pan and begin cooking the passata. Okay, this pan is smoking hot now, so we have to be careful. Have a splatter guard ready, put it in, and put the splatter guard up. And like my tomato sauce recipes, don't rush to stir this. Just let it sit like this for I don't know, about a minute before you stir it. After a minute, the tomatoes are going to start to burn next. Don't overdo it. Add the vegetables in and stir to deglaze. As the vegetables release some moisture, the pan will be possible to deglaze just with the liquid from the vegetables. I'm lowering the heat down now to about 5. There should be an almost burnt smell right now. It should be deep caramelization, right on the verge of burning, but not actually charcoal. We'll add a little bit of the wine in to help it out. And after 3 or 4 minutes of stirring, you may need to use a firmer implement like something metal if you have to scrape the bottom. You should have something like this. There shouldn't be any burnt smell, but there should be some really good dark caramelized vegetables and tomato smell to it. Really dark, but not actually burnt. Okay, now we'll add these herbs in here. Meat back in. And here's one of the keys too. You need this to be sitting on top of the vegetables and the pan to be not very much larger, not very much taller than the meat itself. So getting the right size piece of meat or the right size pan is important here. Now I'm going to add the rest of the wine. Entire bottle. Heat this till it comes to a boil. Okay, you can see bubbles breaking at the surface, and we've got enough liquid here that it covers more than half the meat. That's important because we're going to be turning this over. We want to do half at a time. So now we have this paprika. I'm going to sprinkle mostly over the top, and the rest of it will just go in. Then we're going to put a lid on the pan and transfer this to the oven. After 2 hours has gone by, take it, carefully turn it over. I'm going to put the lid back on for a little bit and return it to the oven. Now it's been another hour. Don't try to turn it over. Just move it around, make sure it's not sticking like this. And now it goes back in the oven. Now no lid on it. Okay, it's been another hour, and now I'm going to add that 15 grams of chopped garlic to this. And it goes back into the oven, still with no lid. Now after about another hour, I'm going to add the hot Hungarian paprika. I'm using one that's actually a dried form of the actual chili itself. You probably won't be able to get this. This is very hard to get outside of Hungary. And then I'm just going to crumble this up. Otherwise you can use about half a teaspoon to a teaspoon of dried hot Hungarian paprika. And here it is being added. Just crumble it up into it. Don't try to turn it over though, it'll fall apart. Okay, now it goes back in the oven again. And eventually the 6 hours is up, and this is fallen apart, but it hasn't broken up into the liquid, which is the important part. That's why we've tied it up and kept that from happening. Now we've got the rest of the liquid to work with here. We're going to pass that to a sieve. The fat separating picture, you can see there's only really a very thin layer of fat here. Now, this is in a fresh pot, and we're going to begin heating this. When it comes up to a simmer, you can add the meat, which I've carefully cleaned of all the rosemary needles, and a couple cloves of garlic, coarsely chopped. Now we're going to let this stew for a little bit, reduce slowly. Medium heat, 5 out of 10. During the same time, I took the handle of a spoon and I used it to clean out the bone marrow. This is the level of simmer we want to see. Good, strong simmer, but not full boil. And it's been about 30 minutes now. And add that last teaspoon of paprika. Getting thick. I'm going to taste it and adjust the salt to about half a teaspoon to 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, maybe a little bit more. This is the point we're cooking it to until you can see it pulls away. There's no excess liquid left at all. Now this is sat in the refrigerator for at least overnight, preferably 2 or 3 days, and you've got these long stringy bits, and what you have to do is you have to remove some of these. These are the parts that you're going to be frying and using not exactly a garnish. It's part of the dish, but you need to get a good amount of this. This is a pretty good amount. Don't take all of it. Now the rest of this is going to be used to make the ragu, and you see if you flip it over, you've still got a lot of this gelatinous material, like concentrated stock. That's good. Okay. So this is going to get ground up in the food processor. Also here we've got some garlic, the passata, and that saved marrow. Usually you would fry the tomato sauce separately, but we already have our deep dark notes in this beef. So this is a little different procedure than I usually use. So the first step, I put the extra meat in, not the meat that I've kept on the side here for frying. This is with just the garlic and the marrow. Okay. Now we're going to add the passata to this. Okay. Now we're going to begin frying this in a different way than you usually see. Heat about a 3 or 4 quart stock pot. I'm adding some olive oil to the bottom of this, but I'm not adding it. The pan is not super hot like usually when I make tomato sauces, and we're just adding a little bit of oil to cover the bottom. And there's some sizzling, but it's not the explosive Mount Vesuvius of reactions like with usual tomato sauces. And this is the amount of material here is cooling this down rapidly. The pan is not hot at the bottom anymore, not very hot. Yeah, that's pretty much all of it. Now I'm just making it into a flat layer at the bottom. And just going to let it cook like this for a few minutes, just like this. Keeping the heat on medium, this is what it looks like after about 4 or 5 minutes. You can see it looks a little bit like a bubbling swamp. Not stirring it at all. Just let it cook, medium heat. Okay, 10 minutes has passed. Now I'm going to stir this around, and you'll see there's some fond sticking to the bottom. So you need to break this up, scrape this off a little bit. It should come up easily. If it doesn't, then you might need to use a metal implement, and next time don't turn the heat up so high. Once I get all this up, I'm going to cook it for another 5 minutes, the same temperature. Okay. 5 more minutes. And during this 5 minutes you can stir it, not like the first 10. Just trying to get rid of any of the extra moisture here. It's been about 5 minutes now. This is quite thick. Now we're ready for the final stage of this. I'm going to add this 400 grams of San Marzano, Italian San Marzano tomatoes. This is actually whole tomatoes. They're going to break up in the sauce as it cooks. Make sure this is well stirred, well integrated. And usually you add salt at the end, but there's no question we're going to need some salt here, so I'm going to add maybe a teaspoon of salt right now. We'll adjust it later. And now this is the heat's gonna go way down to about 2.5, 3, something like that. Just a little bit under 3 out of 10. And I'm gonna put a lid on this in a second, and we're gonna begin the long, slow cooking process of this. Okay, it's been on a back burner now for 1.5 hours total. I'll move it up closer just so you can see it here. Now I'm going to add that final 3/4 of a teaspoon of paprika. Hungarian paprika, in this case. Sweet. And give it a little bit more of a stir. And now we're going to finish the last little cooking segment with no lid on it. And if you're going to eat this right away, this is also the time you're going to proceed to the next step, where you get the pasta ready and you deep fry that beef. And about 30 minutes later, this is ready. You can just turn the heat down to very low, put a lid on it, keep it warm, or you can refrigerate it and reheat it the next day. And normally I would use a regular deep fryer, but it wouldn't be possible for you to see what's going on because the lighting in that area here isn't very good. So I've got a wire mesh strainer. Make sure you use one like this that's all metal. If you use one like this that's got a plastic handle, the handle will melt. So put it in for a minute after the oil has come to temperature. Let it sit for a minute because the metal strainer itself will lower the temperature a bit. And then fry off the beef in batches, like this. And this is the deep fried beef that you end up with. It's a bit stringy and chewy, so I'm going to run a knife through it, cut it up further, and then it'll be put up on the pasta at the end.
I'm very pleased to announce the release of Volume 3, The Focus on Food Chemistry. I want to clear up a few things about these 3 volumes. First, they all contain completely different information. There's no duplication, they're not revisions. When I wrote Volume 1, I had 2.5 years of YouTube videos to cover. People had been asking me for the printed list of ingredients for all of those dishes, and so I obliged. There are recipes with stepwise directions and many tips offered throughout, as well as an extensive history of Russian cuisine over the last 1,000 years, but Volume 1 is very different from Volume 2 and 3. In Volumes 2 and 3, I only had about 9 months of YouTube recipes to cover in each, so I was able to provide stepwise directions for everything. In Volume 2, I included a lot of additional information about cooking and some simple examples of flavor chemistry to set the stage for Volume 3. While Volume 2 hopefully got you thinking about some of the processes that go on in cooking and how flavors are expressed and sensed at the molecular level, the topic was painted with pretty broad strokes to make it easy to digest, pun intended. Volume 3 is a milestone in the series, in which I have included an entire introductory course in food chemistry, which is why Volume 3 is about 70 pages longer than Volume 2. And if you just want the recipes, that's okay too. You don't have to read the first few chapters, but if you've ever been curious about what influences tastes and flavors and the rationale for deciding cooking times and temperatures and why things taste different when they're combined in different ways, this book will answer many of those questions. It also paves the way for Volume 4, which will be next year. I'm pleased to announce a new, completely different type of cookbook. If you watch my channel regularly, you know that the recipes I present are usually centered on meat or seafood and seldom vegetarian dishes. This new book is a departure from that norm. Only vegetables, fruits, eggs, and dairy are used in dozens of recipes here. The key here is that these recipes don't taste like typical vegetarian food. This isn't a bunch of salads and bean sprouts wrapped in pita bread. These are completely satisfying, hearty dishes that use the science of food chemistry to produce meat-like aromas and flavors. But don't worry, there's no weird chemicals involved, just ordinary foods and spices that you can get in any grocery store. This really is an entirely new approach. These are flavorful, filling meals produced by a distinctive cooking method and unexpected combinations of ingredients. Once you see how it's done and understand the method, you can apply these preparations to some of your own recipes and transform them into vegetarian dishes too. Also look for my cocktail book, Cocktails of the South Pacific and Beyond, Advanced Mixology, available through Amazon online. If you want to know more about my adventures as a chef around the world and have some great laughs along the way, be sure to check out the video tour of my book, 40 Years in One Night. It's up on YouTube right now. Click the link.